The morning mist clung to the Mississippi River like a shroud as Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood on the deck of his flagship, studying the imposing bluffs of Vicksburg through his field glasses. It was March 1863, and the Confederate stronghold loomed before him like an impregnable fortress. Carved from the very earth itself, the city sat perched 100 feet above the great river, its cannons commanding every approach, earning it the ominous nickname Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Grant lowered his glasses and turned to his aide-de-camp, Colonel John Aaron Rawlins. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of destiny, "that city holds the key to winning this war. Control the Mississippi, and we split the Confederacy in two." The strategic importance of Vicksburg could not be overstated. The city controlled the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, serving as a vital supply line connecting the trans-Mississippi states of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas with the rest of the Confederate States of America. President Abraham Lincoln himself had declared that Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until the key is in our pocket. For months, Grant had wrestled with the puzzle of Vicksburg. Previous Union attempts had failed spectacularly. Admiral David Glasgow Farragut's naval assault in May 1860 had been repulsed by the city's formidable river batteries. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's frontal assault at Chickasaw Bayou in December 1860 had ended in bloody failure, with over 1,700 Union casualties against fewer than 200 Confederate losses. The Confederate commander defending Vicksburg, Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton, had transformed the city into a fortress of unprecedented strength. Born in Philadelphia, but loyal to his adopted South, Pemberton commanded approximately 33,000 troops, fortified behind elaborate earthworks and trenches that stretched for miles around the city's perimeter. The defensive lines bristled with artillery pieces, many of them heavy siege guns capable of sinking any vessel that dared approach. Grant understood that conventional military wisdom demanded a direct assault, but he had learned from Sherman's costly failure. The bluffs were too steep, the defenses too strong, and the approach too narrow for a frontal attack to succeed. Instead, he began formulating a daring strategy that would require patience, precision, and an iron will to endure months of grinding. Warfare. As reported in Harper's Weekly during the campaign, Grant's army had swelled to over 70,000 men, making it one of the largest Union forces assembled in the Western Theater. The Army of the Tennessee included seasoned veterans from previous campaigns, including the 13th Corps under Major General John Alexander McClernand, the 15th Corps under Sherman, and the 17th Corps under Major General James Birdseye MC First. The general's plan began to take shape as he studied detailed maps of the region. Rather than assault Vicksburg directly, he would march his army down the western bank of the Mississippi, cross below the city, and approach from the undefended eastern side. It was a strategy fraught with risk, requiring his forces to live off the land while severing their own supply lines. But Grant believed it was their only chance of success. Standing on that misty morning in March, Grant made the decision that would define the next 4 months of warfare and ultimately determine the fate of the Confederate cause in the West. The sound of axes echoing through the Louisiana bayous announced the beginning of one of the most audacious military operations in American history. It was late March 1863, and Grant's engineers were carving a path through the swampy wilderness west of Vicksburg, preparing for an unprecedented logistical feat that would test the limits of human endurance and military ingenuity. Grant's plan required Admiral David Dixon Porter's fleet to run past Vicksburg's batteries under cover of darkness, a maneuver that would expose the precious gunboats and transports to devastating fire from the Confederate artillery position on the bluffs above. The operation was scheduled for the night of April 16, 1863, when the moon would be darkest. Porter, a veteran naval commander with a reputation for bold action, assembled 11 vessels for the dangerous passage, 7 gunboats, 3 transports, and 1 towboat. The ships were protected with cotton bales, hay, and logs lashed to their sides to absorb the impact of Confederate shells. Coal barges were positioned to shield the vulnerable paddle wheels, and wet canvas covered the wooden superstructures to prevent fires. As midnight approached on April 16th, the first vessel, the flagship Benton, began its silent approach to the Vicksburg batteries. For nearly an hour, the fleet moved undetected through the darkness, their engines muffled and smokestacks dampened to avoid creating telltale sparks. Then, at approximately 11:30, a Confederate sentry spotted the dark shapes moving on. The river dot the night exploded into chaos as every Confederate battery opened fire simultaneously. The bluffs erupted in sheets of flame, as over 100 cannons sent their deadly projectiles screaming toward the Union fleet. The Henry Clay, a transport vessel, took a direct hit and burst into flames, illuminating the entire river and making the remaining ships easy targets. For the Confederate gunners, Captain George Washington Baird, commanding the gunboat Louisville, later described the scene as hell itself unleashed upon the water. Shell after shell crashed into the vessels, tearing through protective barriers and sending splinters flying like deadly missiles. The transport Fire's Queen was struck repeatedly, but managed to stay afloat, while the gunboat Tuscumbia lost her smokestacks to a direct hit, despite the intense bombardment that lasted over 2 hours. Porter's gamble succeeded beyond all expectations. Only one transport was lost, and the casualties were remarkably light considering the ferocity of the Confederate fire. By dawn on April 17th, 10 of the 11 vessels had successfully passed the Vicksburg batteries and were anchored safely below the city. The psychological impact of the fleet's successful passage was immediate and profound. Confederate morale plummeted as soldiers and civilians alike realized that their supposedly impregnable river fortress had been breached. Union forces across the theater were energized by news of the daring exploit, while Southern newspapers struggled to explain how their vaunted defenses had been overcome. With Porter's fleet now positioned below Vicksburg, Grant could begin the next phase of his campaign. The general ordered his army to march down the western bank of the Mississippi, through the Louisiana countryside, a journey that would take them through 60 miles of swamps, bayous, and muddy roads barely passable for men on foot, let alone the thousands of wagons, artillery pieces, and supply trains that accompanied the 19th century army. The march began on April 20th, with Sherman's 15th Corps leading the way. The soldiers slogged through knee-deep mud, built corduroy roads across impassable swamps, and endured clouds of mosquitoes and other insects that made sleep nearly impossible. Many veterans later recalled this march as more grueling than any battle they had fought. Meanwhile, Grant orchestrated a brilliant deception to confuse Pemberton about his true intentions. He ordered Sherman to make threatening moves against the Chickasaw Bayou defenses north of Vicksburg, while Colonel Benjamin Henry Grierson led a spectacular cavalry raid through the heart of Mississippi, destroying railroads and drawing Confederate attention away from Grant's main force. By the end of April, Grant's army had reached Hard Times Landing, where they prepared to cross the Mississippi River and begin their assault on the Confederate heartland. The pre-dawn darkness of April 30th, 1863, was broken only by the muffled sounds of soldiers checking their equipment and whispering final prayers before the most dangerous river crossing of the Civil War. At Bruinsburg, Mississippi, 30,000 Union troops prepared to step onto enemy soil with no supply lines, no reinforcements, and no retreat possible should their bold gamble fail. Grant stood at the water's edge, watching as the first wave of McClernand's 13th Corps boarded Porter's transports for the crossing. The general had chosen this landing site carefully after extensive reconnaissance revealed it to be lightly defended, but he knew that once his army was committed to the eastern bank, they would be completely dependent on living off the land. In hostile territory, the crossing began at dawn, with the steamers ferrying troops back and forth across the mile-wide river, while Confederate pickets watched helplessly from the bluffs. By noon, over 10,000 Union soldiers had established a beachhead, and by evening, the entire force was across. Not a single man had been lost to enemy action, though the psychological weight of cutting themselves off from their supply base was evident in the tense faces of officers and enlisted men alike, as documented in the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. Grant's decision to march inland without securing his supply lines was virtually unprecedented in military history. Traditional military doctrine demanded that armies maintain secure lines of communication with their bases, but Grant understood that conventional wisdom would not win this campaign. "I now determined," he later wrote, "to move independently of my base and to make the country furnish the supplies I needed." The army began its march inland on May 1st, with scouts ranging far ahead to locate food, forage, and intelligence about Confederate positions. The soldiers quickly adapted to their new circumstances, becoming expert foragers who could find provisions in the most unlikely places: smokehouse, corn cribs, and vegetable gardens throughout the Mississippi countryside contributed to feeding Grant's advancing forces. Lieutenant General Pemberton, meanwhile, found himself caught between conflicting orders from his superiors. President Jefferson Davis and General Joseph Eggleston Johnston urged him to abandon Vicksburg and unite with Confederate forces in the field, while Secretary of War James Alexander Seton and General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard insisted that he hold the city at all costs. This strategic confusion would prove fatal to Confederate hopes in the coming campaign. Grant's first objective was Port Gibson, a small town that controlled the roads leading inland from the river. On May 1st, elements of McClernand's corps encountered Confederate forces under Brigadier General John Stevens Bowen near the town. The Battle of Port Gibson began at dawn and raged throughout the day. As Union forces gradually overwhelmed the outnumbered defenders, Bowen, one of the Confederacy's most capable brigade commanders, conducted a masterful fighting retreat with fewer than 8,000 men against overwhelming odds. His Missouri and Arkansas troops made every Union advance costly, but they could not hold back the tide indefinitely. By evening, the Confederates had withdrawn toward Grand Gulf, leaving Port Gibson in Union hands. The victory at Port Gibson opened the interior of Mississippi to Grant's army and confirmed the wisdom of his unconventional strategy. The soldiers, initially apprehensive about operating without supply lines, gained confidence with each success. They were no longer just an army. They had become a force of nature, moving through the Confederate heartland with unstoppable momentum. Grant immediately pressed his advantage, ordering his 3 corps to advance on separate roads toward the railroad town of Jackson, the capital of Mississippi. He understood that speed was essential. Every day his army remained in Confederate territory increased the risk of being trapped by converging enemy forces. As his troops prepared for the next phase of the campaign, Grant sent a message to General Henry Wager Halleck in Washington that captured the bold spirit of the operation. "I shall not turn back." The morning of May 7th, 1863, dawned with the peculiar stillness that often precedes great events. 40 miles northeast of Vicksburg, the Mississippi state capital of Jackson lay vulnerable and exposed as two Union corps converged on the city like the jaws of a closing trap. Grant had correctly identified Jackson as the strategic key to his entire campaign. By capturing the capital and severing the railroad connections, he would isolate Pemberton's army and eliminate any possibility of Confederate reinforcement. McPherson's 17th Corps approached Jackson from the southwest, while Sherman's 15th Corps advanced from the west, their parallel columns moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The Union soldiers, now fully adapted to living off the land, moved with unprecedented speed through the Mississippi countryside, covering distances that would have been impossible for a conventionally supplied army. In Jackson, Confederate General Johnston had arrived on May 13th to take command of the scattered forces defending the capital. Johnston, one of the South's most respected generals, immediately grasped the desperate nature of the situation. He commanded fewer than 6,000 men against Grant's approaching 40,000, and his forces were poorly positioned to defend the city's extensive perimeter. The assault on Jackson began at dawn on May 14th, with Union artillery opening a devastating bombardment against the hastily constructed Confederate defenses. The thunder of cannons echoed across the capital as shells crashed into government buildings, railroad depots, and military installations. Citizens huddled in their homes as the battle raged through the streets of their city. Sherman's forces struck the main Confederate line north of the city, while McPherson's troops attacked from the west. The fighting was fierce but brief. Johnston's outnumbered defenders could not hope to hold against such overwhelming odds. By afternoon, Confederate resistance had collapsed, and Johnston ordered a general retreat toward the north to avoid the complete destruction of his command. The capture of Jackson represented a strategic triumph that reverberated throughout the Confederacy. Grant's army had severed the vital railroad connecting Vicksburg with the rest of the Confederate states, effectively isolating Pemberton's forces and eliminating any possibility of reinforcement or resupply. The psychological impact was equally devastating. The fall of a state capital to Union forces demonstrated the Confederate government's inability to protect its own territory. Grant wasted no time consolidating his victory. He ordered his engineers to destroy the railroad facilities, bridges, and military infrastructure that made Jackson strategically valuable. The work of destruction continued for 2 days as Union troops systematically dismantled the transportation network that had supported Confederate operations throughout the region. While his army was busy in Jackson, Grant received intelligence that fundamentally changed his strategic calculations. Confederate scouts reported that Pemberton had finally emerged from his Vicksburg fortifications, with approximately 25,000 men, apparently intending to strike at Grant's exposed supply lines. The irony was perfect. Pemberton was searching for supply lines that Grant had deliberately abandoned weeks earlier. Grant immediately recognized the opportunity presented by Pemberton's movement. If he could engage and defeat the Confederate field army before it could retreat to Vicksburg's defenses, the entire campaign would be decided in a single decisive battle. He ordered his 3 corps to abandon Jackson and march west toward the crossroads at Champion Hill, where intelligence suggested Pemberton's army would be forced to pass. The race was now on, with both armies converging on the same objective. Through the rolling hills of central Mississippi, Grant's forces, battle-tested and confident after their string of victories, moved with the swagger of conquerors. They had penetrated deep into Confederate territory, captured the state capital, and scattered every enemy force that dared to oppose them. As the sun set on May 15th, advance elements of both armies were already skirmishing near Champion Hill. The stage was set for the climactic battle that would determine whether Grant's audacious gamble would succeed, or whether Pemberton's army would escape to fight another day behind Vicksburg's formidable defenses. The soldiers on both sides sensed that the next day would bring a decisive confrontation that could determine the fate of the entire Western theater. The fog of May 16, 1863, lifted slowly from the rolling hills east of Vicksburg, revealing the army's position for what would become the most crucial battle of the Vicksburg campaign. Champion Hill, a modest elevation 75 feet above the surrounding countryside, was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Confederate stronghold. On the Mississippi River, Grant's 3 corps, totaling approximately 32,000 men, had converged on the crossroads during the night with the methodical precision that had characterized their entire campaign. McPherson's 17th Corps held the Union left, McClernand's 13th Corps controlled the center and right, while Sherman's 15th Corps remained in reserve, still approaching from Jackson after completing the destruction of the railroad facilities. Pemberton's Confederate army, numbering around 22,000 troops, found itself in an increasingly precarious position as dawn broke over the battlefield. The Confederate general had been maneuvering to strike at what he believed were Grant's supply lines, but his slow-moving columns had been caught in the open by the rapidly advancing Union forces. Now, with his back to the Big Black River and enemy forces converging from multiple directions, Pemberton faced the most challenging tactical situation of his military career. The battle began at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, when Union skirmishers from Brigadier General Alvin Peterson Hovey's division encountered Confederate pickets along the Jackson Road. The crack of rifle fire echoed across the quiet countryside as both sides deployed their main forces for what promised to be a grueling day of combat. Grant, establishing his command post on a hill overlooking the battlefield, immediately recognized the strategic importance of the moment. "We must win this battle," he told his staff officers. "If Pemberton's army escapes to Vicksburg intact, we may face months of siege warfare." The general's understanding of the campaign's broader implications was evident in every order he issued as the fighting intensified. The main assault began at 10:30 when Hovey's division, supported by Brigadier General George Francis McGinnis's brigade, launched a determined attack against the Confederate left flank position on Champion Hill itself. The Union troops advanced through dense timber and underbrush, their battle flags streaming in the morning breeze as they climbed the slopes. Under withering Confederate fire, Confederate Brigadier General Stephen Dill Lee's Alabama troops, positioned at the crest of Champion Hill, poured devastating volleys into the advancing Union ranks. The fighting was savage and personal, with soldiers engaged in hand-to-hand combat among the trees and rocks that crowned the hill. For over an hour, the battle raged back and forth as both sides fed reinforcements into the struggle for this crucial terrain. As documented in the official records, the turning point came when Hovey's exhausted troops were reinforced by Brigadier General James Slack's brigade, which struck the Confederate line at its most vulnerable point. The combined assault proved irresistible, and Lee's defenders were forced to abandon their positions and retreat down the western slope of Champion Hill. The collapse of the Confederate left flank created a crisis for Pemberton's entire army, with Union forces now controlling the high ground and threatening to cut off the Confederate line of retreat. Pemberton was forced to order a general withdrawal toward the Big Black River. The retreat quickly became a rout as disciplined Confederate units dissolved into fleeing crowds of soldiers. Desperate to escape the Union pursuit, Major General William Wing Loring's division, positioned on the Confederate right, became separated from the main army during the chaotic withdrawal. Unable to reach the bridges across the Big Black River, Loring was forced to march south and eventually join Johnston's forces in central Mississippi. This division would never rejoin Pemberton's army, reducing the Vicksburg garrison by nearly 6,000 men. At the most critical moment of the campaign, the Battle of Champion Hill cost Pemberton approximately 4,000 casualties, including many of his most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. Grant's losses were lighter, around 1,000 for 100 men, but more importantly, the Union Army had achieved its primary objective of preventing the Confederate field army from escaping intact to Vicksburg. As the sun set on May 16th, Grant's victorious troops pursued the retreating Confederates toward the Big Black River, where one final obstacle remained before the gates of Vicksburg itself. The morning of May 17, 1863, found the remnants of Pemberton's defeated army desperately trying to cross the Big Black River. Before Grant's pursuing forces could complete their destruction, the Confederate position at the Big Black River Bridge represented the last natural defensive line between the Union Army and Vicksburg itself, and both commanders understood that the fate of the campaign might be decided in the next few hours. Pemberton had positioned Brigadier General John Gregg's Texas Brigade and other rearguard units behind hastily constructed earthworks on the east bank of the river, hoping to delay the Union advance long enough for his main force to cross the railroad bridge and reach the safety of Vicksburg's outer defenses. The Confederate works, constructed during the night, consisted of cotton bales, fence rails, and hastily dug rifle pits that provided minimal protection against a determined assault. Grant, riding with the advance elements of McClernand's corps, could see the Confederate positions clearly through his field glasses. The enemy works appeared formidable from a distance, but the general's experience detected signs of demoralization and hasty construction that suggested the position might not be as strong as it appeared. "Gentlemen," he told his corps commanders, "we must strike immediately before they could strengthen their position or complete their withdrawal." The assault began at 10 o'clock in the morning, when Brigadier General Michael Kelly Lawler's brigade, composed primarily of Wisconsin and Iowa regiments, advanced directly against the center of the Confederate line. Lawler, a massive man known for his aggressive leadership style, personally led his troops across the open ground separating the opposing forces, his sword gleaming in the morning sunlight. As shells exploded around him, the attack succeeded beyond all expectations. The demoralized Confederate defenders, still reeling from their defeat at Champion Hill, offered only token resistance before abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the river. Within minutes, the entire Confederate line had collapsed, and Union troops were pouring across the battlefield in pursuit of the retreating enemy. The scene at the Big Black River Bridge descended into chaos as hundreds of Confederate soldiers attempted to cross the narrow span simultaneously. The bridge, designed for railroad traffic, could accommodate only a few men at a time, creating a deadly bottleneck that trapped much of the rear guard on the east bank. Many soldiers, rather than wait for their turn to cross, plunged into the swift-flowing river and attempted to swim to safety. Brigadier General Gregg, attempting to maintain order during the retreat, was captured along with over 1,000 of his men who could not reach the bridge in time. The Texas Brigade, which had fought with distinction throughout the war, effectively ceased to exist as an organized unit. The psychological impact of this disaster was devastating for Confederate morale. Throughout the Vicksburg garrison, Grant's victory at Big Black River Bridge was achieved at minimal cost, with fewer than 300 Union casualties compared to over 1,700 Confederate losses, including the captured troops. More importantly, the rapid collapse of Confederate resistance demonstrated that Pemberton's army was no longer capable of effective field operations and would be forced to rely entirely on the fixed defenses of Vicksburg itself. As Union engineers worked to repair the damaged bridge, Grant's three corps prepared for the final phase of the campaign. The general established his headquarters at a plantation house overlooking the river and began planning the investment of Vicksburg. He understood that the coming siege would test his army's endurance and his own strategic vision in ways that the previous month's victories had not. Intelligence reports indicated that Vicksburg's defensive perimeter extended for approximately 8 miles, protected by elaborate earthworks, rifle pits, and artillery positions that had been under construction for over a year. The city's civilian population of nearly 5,000 combined with Pemberton's remaining 25,000 troops, created a formidable concentration of humanity that would require careful handling once the siege began. On the evening of May 17th, as his exhausted but victorious troops prepared their equipment for the next day's operations, Grant issued orders for the final advance on Vicksburg. The campaign that had begun with such uncertainty 6 weeks earlier was now approaching its climactic phase, and the general was confident that his unconventional strategy would achieve its ultimate objective. By dawn on May 18th, the Army of the Tennessee was ready to complete its remarkable journey and begin the siege that would decide the fate of the Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. The morning sun of May 19th, 1863, cast long shadows across the Confederate earthworks surrounding Vicksburg, as Grant's 3 corps deployed in a vast semicircle that would eventually encompass the entire city. After 4 to 7 days of brilliant maneuvering, rapid marches, and decisive battles, the Union Army had finally reached the gates of the Confederate Gibraltar, and the most famous siege in American military history was about to begin. Grant's initial plan called for immediate assault on the Confederate defenses, hoping to carry the city by storm before Pemberton's demoralized troops could recover from their recent defeats. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the general ordered a coordinated attack along the entire front, with Sherman's 15th Corps striking the northern defenses while McClernand's 13th Corps and McPherson's 17th Corps assaulted the eastern and southern approaches. The assault was a costly failure. Confederate soldiers, fighting from behind well-constructed earthworks with interlocking fields of fire, repulsed every Union attack with devastating effectiveness. The maze of trenches, rifle pits, and artillery positions that protected Vicksburg had been designed by skilled engineers and improved continuously since the war began. Union casualties mounted rapidly as successive waves of attackers broke against the Confederate defenses like waves against a rocky shore. Grant, observing the failed assault from his command post, realized that Vicksburg could not be taken by direct attack. "We must settle down to a siege," he told his staff officers. "The city is too strong to be carried by assault, but it cannot resist indefinitely if we cut off all supplies and reinforcements." This decision transformed the nature of the campaign from mobile warfare to a methodical siege that would test the endurance of both armies. The Union investment of Vicksburg became a masterpiece of military engineering, as Grant's troops constructed their own elaborate system of trenches, parallels, and artillery positions that gradually extended around the city's entire perimeter. The work continued day and night as soldiers with picks and shovels carved approach trenches that zigzagged toward the Confederate lines, following principles of siege warfare that dated back to the 17th century. By early June, the siege lines extended for over 12 miles, completely encircling Vicksburg and cutting off all land communication with the outside world. Admiral Porter's fleet controlled the Mississippi River approaches, while Grant's army sealed off every road and path leading to the city. The Confederate garrison and civilian population found themselves trapped in what was rapidly becoming a prison of earth and iron. The bombardment of Vicksburg began in earnest on May 22nd and continued relentlessly for the next 6 weeks. Union artillery, positioned in carefully constructed batteries along the siege lines, maintained a constant barrage that destroyed buildings, severed communications, and made normal life impossible for the city's inhabitants. The sound of exploding shells became so constant that residents learned to distinguish between different types of projectiles by their distinctive whistling sounds. Civilian life in besieged Vicksburg took on a surreal quality as families adapted to living underground, in caves carved into the hillsides. The city's newspaper, the WWII, continued publishing on wallpaper when regular newsprint ran out, documenting the daily struggles of a population under siege. Food became increasingly scarce as the weeks passed, with horses, mules, and eventually rats supplementing the dwindling supplies of traditional provisions. Confederate attempts to break the siege failed repeatedly. General Johnston, operating with a small army in central Mississippi, made several half-hearted efforts to approach Vicksburg, but was deterred by Union forces detached for the purpose. The Richmond government, preoccupied with Robert Edward Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania, could spare no significant reinforcements for the Western theater. The siege reached its climax on June 25th when Union engineers detonated a massive mine under the Confederate fortifications known as the 3rd Louisiana Redan. The explosion, which could be heard for miles, created a crater 30 feet deep and 60 feet wide But the subsequent assault failed when Confederate defenders quickly sealed the breach. With rifle fire and artillery by early July, conditions inside Vicksburg had become desperate. Pemberton's soldiers were surviving on quarter rations of pea, bread, and bacon, while scurvy and dysentery weakened the garrison daily. The general, recognizing that further resistance was futile, opened negotiations with Grant on July 3rd. The surrender ceremony took place on July 4th, 1863, as nearly 30,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms. In formal acknowledgment of Union victory, Grant's magnanimous terms, which paroled the Confederate soldiers rather than imprisoning them, reflected his understanding that the war's end would require reconciliation between North and South. The fall of Vicksburg, combined with Lee's defeat at Gettysburg on the same day, marked the turning point of the Civil War. Lincoln's prediction had proven accurate. Vicksburg was indeed the key, and now it was firmly in Union hands. The Mississippi River was open from source to mouth, the Confederacy was split in two, and Grant had established himself as the Union's most successful general. The siege of Vicksburg demonstrated that unconventional strategies, combined with superior logistics and unwavering determination, could overcome even the strongest defensive positions. Grant's campaign had lasted 7 to 7 days and resulted in one of the most complete victories in military history, opening the path to Union triumph in the Civil War.